Many games that put their focus on challenge often drop the player into a dark, decrepit world. One devoid of hope, with muted brown and red color palettes, scored with melancholic orchestral pieces that deliver the weight and danger of their world. On the other hand, Cuphead. Cuphead is visually one of the most incredible games I have ever played. Everything in this game is inspired by an animated-like classic rubber hose animation, particularly Fleischer Studios, which began its life as Inkwell Studios, a name that's now endured into Cuphead as the game's setting of the Inkwell Isle. Enemies are hand-drawn and inked to create a series of extraordinary boss fights, each of which strive to tell their own individual, short, animated story as these bosses grow, warp, and brutally and repeatedly beat the absolute hell out of you through lightning-fast, bullet hell-inspired platforming. Cuphead is hard, really hard, and then, after you've beaten it, it asks you to beat it again, but harder this time. So, today, I want to dive into the bosses of one of my personal favorite games of all time, looking into how they tell their stories through music, animation, and mechanics. If you see Cuphead fighting a boss, that means it's on regular. If Mugman is fighting a boss, then they're fighting the expert version. You can also play the entire game as Miss Chalice, who has an entirely different moveset and interacts with everything differently. Any footage of her that you do see is also going to be on expert. Also, this video is only going to cover the base game of Cuphead. For those new to my channel, I'll also give every boss a letter grade. An F grade boss is a boss I believe makes the game actively worse, one that fails in what it sets out to do and then detracts from the space around it. A D grade boss stumbles and isn't exactly fun to fight, but it doesn't ruin anything around it by its mere presence. A C grade boss is average. It isn't incredible, but there's nothing bad about it. A B grade boss is solid. There's a lot to like, but a few aspects in my opinion do hold it back. An A grade boss is a great boss fight, the kind of boss you're excited to face again every single time. The S grade bosses, meanwhile, are the bosses that stick in your mind long after the game is done. With that said, these were some of the hardest grades I've ever given. There's only a small handful of Cuphead boss fights that I would struggle to see as someone's favorite encounter, so these grades in particular are likely going to be a lot more subjective and uniform than usual, since a large part of how the boss lands comes down to the player's personal sense of humor and their personal difficulty tastes. So, let's get ready for a swell battle. Cuphead bosses can be fought in a pretty flexible order, but within Aisle 1 of Cuphead there is a pretty clear structure. The game opens with 2 tutorial encounters that introduce basic dodging mechanics, the first of which is Goopy le Grande, in Ruse of an Ooze. Goopy focuses his tutorial education on awareness of where the boss is moving next and making sure the players position themselves to dodge that upcoming threat. The first and second phase only have 2 attacks each, and the final phase only has 1 attack. At the beginning of the battle, Goopy leaps around the arena, with the vertical and horizontal difference of each jump varying randomly as he does so. Occasionally he will stop in place and give a huge telegraph before he inflates himself into a boxing glove. The player can try to jump over him or move far enough away from him, but they're rewarded in a big way by learning to duck underneath the boxing glove in order to keep shooting throughout the entire animation. The second phase starts with Goopy popping a pill, creating a few question marks that are effectively 3 free parries. Neither of these tutorial bosses are too interested in making sure you know how to parry, so this ends up being more present for the people going for that S grade. He grows in size and does the same thing he did last time, albeit now with less screen real estate for the player to work with. The animations here also change his characterization in a really fun way. The first phase Goopy is smiling constantly, whereas the second phase Goopy has a much more sinister grin, baring his teeth while trying to punch out the brothers. Though not nearly as insane as many later transformations, it does still make the 2 phases feel distinct, despite the fact they're virtually identical. The biggest change from the first to the second phase is that you can't really dodge behind Goopy whenever he decides to punch forward, now wearing an actual boxing glove. Since the punch takes up so much more of the screen, it means it's easy to have no way to dodge other than to duck underneath. Though it can catch a new player off guard, putting such a heavy focus on teaching players to be aware of where their hurtbox is a great skill to test this early on in the tutorial, and in this simple of a fight, it's a pretty easy way to ease players in. At the end of the second phase, Goopy spends a long time spinning around for the player to get more damage before his gravestone comes crashing from the sky. This phase focuses on teaching new players about aiming, and is usually the easiest of the 3 to dodge. The previous phases, outside of mid-jump, were both locked on the ground, meaning holding down the shoot button while pointing in Goopy's general direction would eventually lead to a win. But with the gravestone's much smaller airborne hitbox, the player does need to more intentionally chase after Goopy in order to deal damage. Goopy will stop and smash into the ground, forcing the player to dash out from underneath him. Usually, a single dash in either direction is enough to escape, which leaves this phase pretty harmless once the player is comfortable with the game's controls. Goopy lacks the spectacle and replayability of the best fights of Cuphead, but he does well enough as one of the game's tutorials. The emphasis on attacks coming one at a time stops the fight from ever becoming overwhelming, while also ensuring that the player knows how to duck, position, aim, and dash their way to victory. Because of that, I think Goopy earns a high C grade. With more complexity or something in expert mode that helps him keep pace with the rest of the game, I think he'd stand a lot better, but he just isn't very satisfying to refight. Also, this video will be including pun appreciation time. Whenever you die in Cuphead, you see how far you made it in the fight, and you get some death quotes. I'm going to call out my favorite in each fight and then rank them at the end because these puns are amazing. My personal favorite pun for Goopy is in his third phase. I'm very smashing, even in grave situations. The second tutorial encounter, being the Root Pack in Botanic Panic, manages to stand on its own legs, even without legs, as a tutorial-esque boss fight much more than Goopy did. Rather than a single evolving enemy, the Root Pack is a gauntlet of 3 individual foes, each of which attack the player in their own unique way to enforce specific aspects of the player's movement capabilities. The first of the trio, Sal Sputter, focuses on the player's jump. He spits 4 times, with the speed increasing until the attacks come out 3 times. At that point, he returns back to his original speed. At the end of each set of 4 is a parryable worm, serving as the main moment to get parries within this fight. The goal with Sal is pretty clear. Teach the player to time their jumps while keeping their finger on whatever they've chosen to be the attack button. Even next to Goopy, this is probably the easiest phase within the 2 tutorial fights. After Sal goes down, Ollie Bulb rises up and starts nervously looking around. Once the player attacks him, he starts to cry, dropping tears from the sky as an attack. Some are occasionally parryable, but it's rare to be fully worth the risk with how unpredictable the tear pattern can often be. There's not a realistic way to switch which side of Ollie the player is on either, meaning that once Ollie rises, the player is trapped in just a third of the screen while still keeping the whole screen visually interesting. Cuphead really likes using these visual flares to restrain the player without making them feel trapped or claustrophobic. Especially in the game's first bullet hell-esque phase, using this visual trick keeps things easy to digest by lowering the number of factors the player ever needs to worry about. The direction of projectiles here is uniform, and the restricted screen space means that the player only has to really look at a very small portion of the screen. Finally, the carrot overlord Chansey Chantenay rises to finish the battle with his psychic powers. Like with the final phase of Goopy, Chansey's hitbox is lifted off the ground, forcing players to aim up or diagonally as they dodge his attacks. He summons destructible carrots that home in towards the player before switching to a new pose and shooting psychic rays 3 times. Interestingly, the rays shoot twice in expert mode instead of 3 times, but less attacks means less time to get rid of the waves of carrots before more begin spawning again, making the entire phase feel a lot more chaotic. On top of all these phases, the Root Pack introduces what might be my favorite mechanic in Cuphead, the secret phases. When Ollie rises up, he doesn't start attacking until the player damages him. So if the player decides to sit and wait instead of attacking, Ollie smiles at Cuphead's kindness and leaves. However, when Chansey rises up after, he brings Horace Radish with him to join in with the final phase, making it a lot more challenging. Horace always spins towards the player on the ground, and with the ground now having an added danger, the player is often forced into the air, which is where all of Chansey's threat is. It makes for a really engaging final phase, and it's pretty realistic for a player to run into it and then realize that there might be tons of these phases tucked away. The Root Pack, like a lot of my favorite bosses in Cuphead, is packed with references and details that also make them a ton of fun. The most obvious is that the Root Pack's name is a reference to the Rat Pack, a group of entertainers from the 1950s like Frank Sinatra, Humphrey Bogart, Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin, so on and so forth. On top of that, we can notice that the fertilizer in the background is Acme Grow. Here's a fun fact about Acme. It was a company name used as a placeholder in lieu of actual references that would potentially lead to copyright infringement. Since then, it's become a name and brand in and of itself. On top of all this, all the vegetables that appear are root vegetables, hence the Root Pack, and the attacks are direct references to what the vegetables are known for. Potatoes are known for being covered with dirt and worms, and onions make you cry. Carrots are supposed to be good for your eyesight due to beta-carotene, so Chansey has incredible eyesight with his third eye. hence his psychic powers. It is such a perfectly dumb pun that makes nonsensical psychic powers in a vegetable-themed boss into the butt of a great joke. Chauncey also wins my favorite death quote because of that pun. I'm lean, mean, and full of beta-carotene. And all that's before getting to the music. There isn't a single bad boss theme in Cuphead, but Botanic Panic just goes so absolutely wild for a tutorial theme, especially as the song progresses. It's easily one of my favorite tracks. The Root Pack, for me, is Cuphead's big selling moment. It's simple enough to be accessible while providing a challenge for a new player, secrets and alternate paths for returning players to take, and an amazing tongue-in-cheek nature that the player can't help but fall in love with. The Root Pack earns an A grade. Though they similarly lack the complexity of later fights, they cover way more tutorial ground than Goopy does, have more engaging phases with a variety of jokes and Easter eggs for players to discover, and they do serve as more of a real challenge from experts since their framework is easier to build upon in a way that creates a satisfying challenge. Stepping out of the tutorial and into slightly more complicated boss fights, the game really kicks off with Ribby and Croaks in Clipped Joint Calamity, who both play with the gambling theme of Cuphead while also being a massive love letter to the Street Fighter franchise of all things. Starting with the references this time, their opening poses are lifted from Ken and Ryu in Third Strike, and Ribby's first phase attacks shoots Hadouken-like projectiles. There's a lot more small details you can find, like the inhale from Croaks before spitting fireflies, potentially referencing Dalsum, or each of the slot machine faces potentially being additional references to other characters, but those have always felt less direct than the Hadouken and the taunts. Each of the frogs have one attack in the first phase. Ribby will do the aforementioned Hadouken attack barrage, with the punches following a predictable pattern that the player has to dodge through. One of the first 3 Hadoukens is always parryable, with every third one after similarly being pink. It provides a great opportunity for a player to get their parries in and predict what's coming next once you know what to expect. Croaks' attack, on the other hand, is pretty underwhelming. He spits out flaming fireflies, which is a great pun, but they move really slowly towards the players, and the brothers do nothing while the fireflies migrate across the stage. The fireflies die pretty quickly too, so they really don't pose any major risk at all here, which brings down this first phase a lot. With that said, the phase works a lot more effectively in Expert Mode, where both these attacks overlap. Ribby's barrage becomes much shorter, making the parries harder to abuse, and Croaks spits out fireflies at the exact same time. Since the player is constantly dodging barrages, the fireflies' slow movement lands in a much better place, providing a solid threat without drawing the player's focus too much from Ribby's more direct attack. After their health gets low enough, Ribby crosses the screen, and you get one of the few attacks in the game that messes with your ability to move. Croaks turns into a giant fan, blowing the player towards Ribby, while Ribby starts to release a diagonally moving orb that bounces between the top and bottom of the screen. Though messing with the player's movement always risks frustration, these 2 attacks don't ever usually create that. In fact, the fan being on has always felt like it made it easier to dodge the orb. Since the objects aren't affected by the wind in the same way the player is, the player can often just let the fan wind dodge the attack for them rather than needing to reposition in any way. Expert makes a lot of improvements to this phase as well as the first, letting Ribby do another Hadouken barrage instead, which proves to be much more threatening. Getting the parry with the wind active can be pretty tough, and with the attacks coming out faster, the player really needs to watch their positioning. Before I dive into the final phase though, I do want to shout out this fly, who is very excitedly watching this final fight with his utensils. I don't know if this man is hoping that you win and he gets to eat the frogs in some long-awaited and horrific role reversal, or if he's just really hungry and willing to eat a cup. Whatever it is, I'll have what his date's having because she is loving life right now. The entire background and music here is so much fun. It's chaotic and there is so much motion that keeps this room feeling so alive, especially when combined with the absolute fire that is the Clipped Joint Calamity track. That said, this lets me bring up one of my biggest universal issues with Cuphead's soundtrack. It's too good. Clipped Joint Calamity specifically has a shout chorus that starts its build-up around 2 minutes and 48 seconds into the song, and it doesn't hit the final chorus until 3 minutes and 10 seconds into the track. And that shout chorus is one of my favorite parts of the Cuphead soundtrack. The fight, however, is usually over in less than 2 minutes, which means unless players go out of the way to listen to the music, they've probably never heard this absolutely incredible piece of music in its entirety, which is a shame. In other news, watch this animation of Ribby's foot stepping back into the arena after he crashes into something off screen. I don't know why this step back into frame is so funny to me, but it is. The third phase is the most demanding in the game thus far, though it does start to get eclipsed pretty quickly. Ribby rolls back across the screen into Croaks' mouth, transforming into a giant slot machine, which fits with the dive bar vibe of the fight, but also feels like there's a joke here that I'm missing. They start spitting coins that track the player pretty well, eventually dropping their crank. Once the player parries that crank, they randomly get one of 3 attack patterns as the machine spits out chips with a unique threat. The snake chips move across the ground, speeding as they go, having the player leap between them to avoid being pushed to the ground and taking damage from the side of the chips. The bull creates hovering discs that signal whether they'll shoot fire up or down, forcing the player to weave vertically among them. Finally, the tiger has slower moving chips with bouncing balls, all moving at their own individual speed that the player needs to jump through. This one is easily the hardest of the phases, as the player needs to balance the distance of the chips with different vertical dodges, all one after the other, rather than just playing floor is lava or moving up and down. The brothers can only be damaged here when there is an active attack, which does a great job forcing the player to focus on their directionality as they're dodging whatever came up on the slot machine. Turning the crank, however, is the part that for some reason I always seem to struggle with. Especially on Expert, the chips come out incredibly fast, and being so close to tracking projectiles while landing a parry is the first time the game really tries to get the player to consider where their parry's going to put them after they regain the ability to take damage. Though there are a lot of small things with Ribby and Croaks that I have problems with, like the fireflies in the second phase, I think they still solidly sit in the B grade. Mostly because Expert mode fixed all the larger problems I had with the fight on the regular difficulty. Their death screens aren't my favorite though, as their first and second lines are just rhymes. So my favorite death line goes to the machines: "You went for broke, and now you're croaked." Once the player has started to get the basic mechanics of Cuphead, they're thrown into a far more brutal tutorial level as they get their first taste of plane combat, facing Hilda Berg in Threatenin' Zeppelin. The plane levels in Cuphead are often considered by the community to be the harder level type, as the player gains the ability to move up and down at will, which means more complicated bullet hell patterns. Personally, I've always found that though they're harder to learn, they're a lot easier to master than the rest of the Cuphead combat. Even among them, though, I consider Hilda the easiest of the plane levels by a pretty decent margin, even if she doesn't feel easy at all on a first playthrough. Her design begins as a mix of a lot of women from classic cartoons. She has Betty Boop's color scheme and combines that with Olive Oil's body shape and absurdly long nose. She eats a cloud to start the fight, turning herself into a hybrid Zeppelin human riding on a unicycle. This Zeppelin is, of course, the source of the pun in her name. Hindenburg, Hilda Berg. Hilda's first phase is also one of the most unique in the game, as it ends up becoming a combination of multiple phases all bundled together, as she alternates between her Zeppelin form and Constellation phases. In the Zeppelin phase, she'll move up and down, summoning smaller Zeppelins that evolve as the fight progresses. She can also conjure a tornado that chases the player down for a while, or laughs, creating the word "ha" as a physical attack that moves horizontally across the screen, which is a contender for one of my favorite attacks in the game. Twice during this phase, Hilda will inflate herself and fly across the screen, creating a zodiac sign out of stars. There are 3 she can transform into, with her options being based on the player's difficulty selection. The Taurus is the simplest, and thus appears first in both simple and regular, while not making an appearance on expert mode. It moves up and down, and occasionally does an attack that covers a horizontal stretch of the screen. Gemini is the next most complicated, appearing second in simple mode as a 50-50 option as the second in regular, or first in expert. Gemini floats in place, and occasionally summons a sphere in the center of the player's space of the arena, starting a bullet spread that draws a full circle around the arena, forcing the player to outrun it. Neither of these two, however, are too intense, and personally I find them even easier than her normal Zeppelin phase. The Sagittarius constellation, which appears in the 50-50 in regular or as the second transformation in expert, is a lot more engaging. He pulls back his bow and releases an arrow as a projectile, spawning 3 stars that track the player and last for a long while if not destroyed alongside it. If the player doesn't take the time to handle the stars, they can last back into the Zeppelin phase, and the bleed over of these phases is one of the things that can make Hilda Berg stand out so much. It also takes advantage of one of the hardest parts of plane levels. The player can only shoot to the right, which means a lot of tracking objects that can end up on the player's left are a lot more dangerous than they'd usually be. After the player empties her 3rd Zeppelin health bar, she screams and turns into the moon, taking up most of the screen. Unfortunately, this is one of the only phases in Cuphead that I almost constantly run into a glitch with. For some reason, she just doesn't change sometimes. And since she's invincible in the transition, I have lost so many good S-rank attempts from Hilda burning through enough time that I miss my 2-minute deadline. The phase itself is great, though, especially as a climax. Stars fly horizontally across the screen, forcing the player to dodge vertically or occasionally parry some of them. Hilda will burst out her face from within the moon, laughing hysterically, while UFOs fly out from behind where her face used to be. The UFO color telegraphs if the player needs to stay behind them after they activate, or rush immediately through them while they do. It gives a great horizontally avoided threat versus the star's vertically avoided threat, which creates a grid that players have to weave through as they move through the phase. I also have a personal theory that the moon is a pun based off a niche comic history fact. Olive Oyl, one of the women who Hilda's appearance was based on, is most well known as Popeye's girlfriend, but she didn't start as that. In her comics introduction, she was originally dating Harold Hamgravy, with the joke being that both of them were, by the ideals of the time, bad partners. Eventually, that relationship fell apart in a pretty long series of comics, leading to an eventual relationship with the later introduced Popeye. But the main plot point leading to their breakup was Olive contracting lunaphobia. The comic defined lunaphobia as Olive getting so angry at Harold that she'd go loony. Lunaphobia, by that definition, isn't a real thing though, but it is an alternative word that can be used in lieu of selenophobia, which is, as anyone playing Hades 2 right now could tell you, a fear of the moon, leading to this final phase's design. Now that may be a coincidence, but it's one I enjoy. Overall, Hilda Berg is another A-grade fight. I wish the astrology phases had a little more depth, especially Taurus and Gemini, as their simple nature does hold back that first phase a bit for me, as does that frequently frustrating bug. Beyond that, the animation and evolution of Hilda over the course of the battle and that incredibly satisfying second phase makes her a great introduction to the plane levels. My favorite of her in-game death lines is fitting, isn't it? I'm a blimp, you're a wimp. According to the wiki, though, one of her cut death lines in an old demo was, "Gotta be nimble, gotta be quick when you mess around with this lunatic," which plays even harder into the moon puns with the Luna lunatic. But that same wiki also says that Hilda Berg's design was very largely inspired by Pearl from Steven Universe, and I can't find a second source of that quote, so the "I'm a blimp, you're a wimp" line is still getting the official vote. As I mentioned earlier, bosses in Cuphead don't really have a set order to fighting them outside of the aisles as a whole, but each aisle still ends with a boss that has always felt like the clear final boss of their respective island. These fights focus on taking a lot of the concepts that the aisle taught and putting them all together, with the final boss of Aisle 1 being Cagney Carnation in Floral Fury. Before we even touch the rest of the boss fight, we have to talk about the titular song though. Despite being the only boss theme in the base game that isn't your classic big band jazz sound, featuring more of a samba rhythm, this song is iconic for a reason. The unique instrumentation, the heavy drum rhythm that matches with Cagney's dancing, and the fact that the unique piece of the song is immediately introduced really makes the track stand out. When people think of Cuphead music, Floral Fury will often come to mind within the first couple of tracks. It's just so much fun, and joins along with the rest of the fight to help Carnation feel like a culmination of the island. Difficulty will always be subjective, but Cagney has always been the hardest Aisle 1 boss to me. His first phase is broken into smaller sub-phases that change based on your difficulty, with each unique sub-phase pulling from a shared collection of attacks. The simplest of these attacks features Cagney pulling back and then covering either the top or bottom half of the screen for a short time, forcing the player up onto the platforms or down onto the ground. If the player has a high damage short-range weapon like Lobber or Spread, this attack is incredibly exploitable. The other two attacks carry most of the threat here though. First, he can clap his hands together and spawn either a boomerang that covers the platforms before looping back around the ground, or he creates a set of nuts that each release on a slight delay, targeted at the player's location in a straight line. On Expert, the number of nuts here increases, and they end up being the largest threat of these two. If the player is ready for it, the boomerang often struggles to catch them off guard. It can remove some escape options depending on what moves follows, but it's pretty rare. He does usually perform the summon attack 2 to 3 times in a row, so the RNG here can play a slight factor, but never enough to be frustrating, just enough to keep it dynamic what kind of solutions you need to have available. The final of his attacks turns his face into a Gatling gun, dropping a collection of 3 types of seeds that each turn into minions, and this is the attack that really defines his first phase for me. The purple seeds are a non-issue, summoning bitey plants that sit on the ground unmoving, where the blue seeds create a vine that releases a gnashing plant that homes towards the player. The pink seed can be parried, though where it spawns can occasionally make this unrealistic. If this seed manages to root, it grows into a flying creature that spits out more parryable projectiles. Though most of the minions die while moving to the second phase, this one stays, so keeping control of the skies is key here, especially on Expert, where Cagney can summon 2 of these enemies instead of just 1. It's really satisfying to weave among the siege while trying to position yourself in a way that deals with the minions as quickly as possible before Cagney moves to his next attack. With that said, I think that the single hardest Expert phase in Aisle 1 is the very beginning of this fight, where all Cagney does, without pausing, is shoot out blue and pink seeds. This phase gets out of hand fast in a way no other boss on Aisle 1 is able to do, though his other sub-phases in Expert are much simpler as he just starts alternating between his summons and lunge. But with each of these attacks testing different skills, Cagney serves as a final challenge by using lingering attacks that force the player to constantly think of their positioning and how they'll handle whatever comes next. The chaotic Samba also works perfectly for this type of phase, and the evolving movesets within these sub-phases keeps what is a 2-phase boss from feeling as static as you'd expect. I personally believe that the second phase isn't quite as strong as the first, but it does still work as a pretty solid climax. Digging into the ground, the bottom half of the arena is cut off and Cagney starts to perform 2 attacks at once. First, vines will sprout out around 2 platforms with a slight delay, forcing the player onto the safe one, while Cagney's tongue grows fingers and starts to throw fuzzy dandelions towards the player, some of which can be parried. When you get hit by these, the screen becomes fuzzy and out of focus, making dodging the following attacks much harder. The attacks here are often infrequent, but like the first phase, the fight focuses on being simple unless you lose control. If you haven't destroyed the parryable seed minions, or you get hit by the dandelions at a bad time, it's pretty easy to find yourself struggling to find anywhere safe to take a breath here. But if you're on top of the fight, it seems almost simple compared to everything that's come before. The dandelions are also a cute little reference to the fuzzies in Super Mario World 2. When you get hit by a dandelion for the first time, you get the achievement Touch Fuzzy Get Dizzy, which is the name of the level that introduced fuzzies as enemies back in Super Mario, which do the same thing to the player's visibility. The Gatling gun transformation is also another collection of puns and references. Cagney's second name, Carnation, obviously comes from a flower that he doesn't really look like, but his first name comes from the actor James Cagney. Cagney was an early film actor known for his films like Public Enemy, which is a film that cemented him as the iconic film gangster, which could be one source for the gun. But on top of that, as any botanists in the comments section would know, the part of the plant that produces the seeds is called the pistil. I just love this game, it's incredible. Cagney's second phase is my favorite of the 2 death quotes here. With so many puns and jokes, there is something hilarious about Cagney just screaming, "Extreme pollination and total domination." There's no pun here, but it's still a great death scream. Overall, Cagney's going to be the first boss in Cuphead that earns the S grade. He has a ridiculously contagious energy, and his design rewarding expertise by letting the player completely avoid most of his threats by managing their environment makes him a satisfying final encounter for the Isle. Opening up Aisle 2, we have Beppi the Clown in Carnival Kerfuffle, a boss who wears his inspiration, Coco the Clown, on his sleeve even more than other bosses. Beppi features 4 completely distinct phases, and alongside the other 2 bosses immediately accessible in Aisle 2, helps communicate the escalating difficulty moving into the middle of the game. With that said, out of Beppi's 4 phases, there's only really 2 I feel are completely successful. The first is one of the ones I'm not a big fan of, featuring Beppi jumping into a bumper car and moving forwards and backwards randomly, before occasionally stopping and charging across the screen. While he's doing this, ducks will start to move along the top half of the screen, each able to be removed as an obstacle in a single hit. Some are parryable, while others will carry light bulbs that drop either when the player moves underneath the duck or destroys it, leaving a small lingering flame as a hitbox. I've never personally liked the way that the bumper car moves here. Sometimes it stays pushed back against the wall and provides absolutely no threat, whereas other times it moves across almost the entire stage. The biggest issue with this phase for me, though, is that it doesn't really play into anything with the rest of the boss fight's main challenge, balancing 2 major threats at once. For the entire rest of the boss fight, Beppi's attacks are designed to be very simple, but complicated by a looping roller coaster that the player needs to be constantly aware of. The first phase doesn't, and so it ends up feeling way slower than the rest of the fight. Weapon selection can also play a big role here. Weapons like Spread or Lobber struggle with the unpredictable nature of the bumper car, whereas weapons like Roundabout reduce the phase to a single dodge every 10 or so seconds if he decides to charge across the screen. After falling off his bumper car and starting the roller coaster, Pennywise here moves on to his next clown trick: balloons. He inflates himself and watches over the player as balloon dogs gnash their way towards them, spawning 2 to 4 every couple of seconds. They lightly track the player at first, but they'll never turn around, meaning they're pretty easy to avoid or destroy. The roller coaster introduction is also done really smoothly. When Beppi falls off the stage, he takes a while to inflate himself, and the player is introduced to the sound cue of the roller coaster as they see it cross in the background. Then, it spawns before the dogs do with another sound cue, meaning it avoids ever blindsiding a player even on the first attempt. Jumping over Beppi's prisoners/guests and keeping your gun aimed upwards eventually moves into the third phase, which is the only other phase that never really clicked for me. The roller coaster continues uninterrupted while Beppi comes down on the left or right edge of the screen on a yellow or green horse. The yellow horse spits out a row of horseshoes that fly across the middle of the screen before coming back along the top and falling down with a single gap, whereas the green horse spits out 2 horseshoes, 3 on expert, some of which can be parried as they make a parabolic shape. The big issue here is how RNG dependent this phase is. Sometimes the horses just don't line up with the roller coaster, meaning you can stand under them and the phase poses less than no threat. Other times, you end up with the horse spawning in an inconvenient place that can make moving around the horseshoes incredibly precise, especially when there are specific places you need to stand that might not be safe to stand in, or need to jump over something right as the entire middle of the screen becomes dangerous. The transition into his final phase is also really long, almost 16 seconds of dead time where the boss does not attack and cannot be damaged. The roller coaster is still running, however, which can kill an unobservant player, or a player who hypothetically were to get distracted despite having played this game multiple times, who just stands there and lets themselves die like a moron, hypothetically. After the final phase does finally begin, Beppi transforms into a carnival ride, giving the player rotating platforms to leap between while the roller coaster increases in speed to just be a solid obstacle rather than a series of people that the player needs to leap over. Between every time that the roller coaster rushes through, he spits out 4 penguins, 2 on each side of his body, that begin to throw baseballs at the player. This assault can be pretty overwhelming as the attacks come from multiple angles at once, move decently fast, and there's not much space to maneuver around them in the air. They'll keep going until the roller coaster reappears, destroying the penguins as the player is forced back onto the ride and beginning the cycle again. I like this phase a lot. The theming is great with the carnival and penguins and baseballs, and the rhythm of the penguins with the roller coaster is really satisfying to learn. And Beppi's huge hitbox in the center of the screen makes it incredibly satisfying to use short-range weapons. The biggest struggles I have with Beppi are the unpredictable RNG in Phase 1 and 3, and how long every transition between phases takes. Rather than the randomness of the attacks being the challenge, the issue is often the way that attacks overlap, which has a lot more potential for frustration. His theming is great, and his music is one of my favorite implemented tracks in the game. The gimmick of the song, which is everything but the piano dropping out, is introduced early enough that the cool parts of the song get a chance to show off during the fight, which I love. On top of that, all the instruments dropping out alongside a phase transition, if it times out correctly, is really cool. I think Beppi earns a low B grade. He's got some great highs, but the few disappointing phases really drag the fight down for me, especially with the simplicity of the first phase and randomness of the third. With that said, the puns within these death screens are the most beautifully corny in the game. Every one of these is gold, but I think my favorite death quote has to come from my least favorite boss phase. Why'd the clown drive over the cup? You wanted to crack him up. Once the player has reached Aisle 2, they receive an upgrade to their plane, allowing them to swap between the classic bullets and a slower moving bomb that drops down from the player's location. Right after getting it, they also get the opportunity to use it on the second plane boss, Djimmi the Genie, in Pyramid Peril. Despite featuring 5 unique phases, I've always found Djimmi to, like Hilda Berg, lean towards the easier side of the plane bosses, especially considering the 3 plane bosses that are still yet to come. In the first phase, there's a random roll between one of 3 attacks as Djimmi pulls out a treasure chest. First, a barrage of random jewels and gems flies towards the player, with some of them being parryable. By keeping their distance, this isn't too hard to dodge on its own, but Djimmi layers a huge skull blast with each of these attacks, and that blast can combine with this to create a few nasty traps for the player. Second, 2 cat sarcophagi are sent towards the player, opening to reveal 4 smaller homing cats, one of which is often parryable. The biggest issue I find here is that the cats often start in a big pile, meaning they immediately overlap with the parryable cat, which can be pretty frustrating. On top of that, this attack really intensifies on expert to a degree other attacks just don't. The speed amps up in a big way, there are 3 sarcophagi instead of 2, and each sarcophagi has 6 instead of 4 cats. Expert is always harder, but this move in particular just really went nuts here. The final of the first phase options is a series of 4 swords that fly to the top, left, or bottom of the screen before homing towards the player in a straight line one at a time. Like the cats, one of these is often parryable, and it ends up being the easiest attack by a pretty wide margin, especially since the player is able to watch Djimmi more effectively to avoid the Skull Blast rather than the more chaotic alternatives. Though RNG plays a part in how simple Djimmi is, I prefer this kind of early fight RNG that doesn't screw the player over with positioning and instead just provides a unique challenge in each attempt, and putting it at the beginning as 3 wholly unique attacks means players can quickly reset if they absolutely do not want to deal with a particular move. After that phase, Djimmi teleports away and the pillar phase begins. Like Hilda Berg, this is another plain boss with an incredibly unique boss phase. There are a set number of pillars every time, each of which have 1 or 2 pieces made out of Djimmi's face. Each face has a few hit points and the player needs to move through these pillars. However, any damage done here carries to the next phase, encouraging players to destroy every face rather than take the easiest path. Or it would be if the third phase wasn't my personal vote for the easiest plane level phase. Djimmi climbs out in a sarcophagus and starts moving vertically up and down. If you stand in front of him, he's got a lot going on. There is a brutal barrage of ghosts that fly out really quickly. He's shooting his eyes at these hard to track projectiles that meet past the middle and then extend out a variable amount, and you have to be moving up and down to try to hit what's a pretty small hitbox. Alternatively, if you switch to dropping bombs, you can just stay up here and never have to worry about the eyes and pretty much avoid every single ghost while not ever thinking too hard about it. Kinda disappointing. It's very possible that this phase is as easy as it is to make sure that the players have collected the bomb. It is technically missable if you aren't talking to NPCs after all, and so not having it makes this phase a really big obstacle. Once it drops though, the sarcophagus does start crying as it hops away. Djimmi finally reappears after, fun fact, his feet are lamps, and focuses on the player here. His body turns into a puppeteering hand as he raises a puppet version of Cuphead. This phase is the hardest of his 5 phases for me, but it's also my favorite. His turban will chase the player around, eventually stopping and spitting out bullets in a spiraling pattern, while the puppet Cuphead moves around before eventually stopping and shooting a pea shooter inspired set of projectiles, with the last set of each usually being parryable. Djimmi really starts to press into the player's personal space here, with where the player guides the hat combining with the puppet's movements to occasionally trap the player to half the screen with 2 sets of projectiles moving at unique speeds and shapes. It's a lot, but really satisfying, and also features the game's second secret phase. Shrink your plane, and the Cuphead Djimmi creates will be a baby, which skips the phase entirely in exchange for that baby Cuphead joining in on the last phase, which, again, is just so much fun. The baby Cuphead is incredibly cute, and this is just one of my favorite secret phases because it just does such a massive shift to the fight's pacing, provides a unique challenge, and is one of the easiest to find and mess around with. The final phase also focuses on restricting the player's space. Djimmi does take up a third of the screen himself, but creates 3 pyramids that circle around Cuphead. Djimmi shoots off some psi waves that move incredibly slowly and cut off a huge space, while a random pyramid grows an eye and creates a moving cross the player needs to be ready to avoid before it explodes out. If the baby Cuphead is present, he sits in the center of this space, spinning his head and shooting a single projectile. It's predictable, and it adds just enough chaos to be exciting, while also amplifying the specific challenge that this phase tries to present. On his own, Djimmi would probably earn a high B grade, but the entire secret phase makes the entire ending of the battle so much fun that I think he does earn an A grade. His death quotes are also the only one I'm going to give a direct honorable mention to. If the player uses Djimmi's wishes to give themselves more hit points and then still dies, he says, "You foolish cups could not best me, even with my wishes 3. Which I love. Hidden details like that are just incredibly fun to run into, and give a little flair to players who are struggling enough to need to use the wishes. In terms of my favorite death quote proper, that has to go to the puppet. "That beating was for free. No strings attached." Though, "Do you need to borrow my sarcophagus" is close just because of how little of an actual joke there is. The final of the 3 immediately accessible bosses in Aisle 2 is Baroness von Bon Bon and Sugarland Shimmy, who, like Djimmi's first phase, uses a collection of random phases to vary each encounter, which can lead to some extreme variation in difficulty, but still never feels unfair. This fight is 4 phases long, the first 3 phases each pulling from one of 5 possible mini-bosses: a Jawbreaker, Gumball Machine, Waffle, Candy Corn, and Cupcake. As the fight continues, the Baroness starts to add in small attacks onto whatever mini-boss is fighting, before before eventually having our own final phase. I'm going to go over the mini-bosses from my least to most favorite, and though these bosses don't have any official names, Keenan Araki, one of Cuphead's animators, did name them all in an old tweet, so I'll be using those names today. Throughout each of these phases, there is a moving platform about halfway up the screen the player can use to get up off the ground, but it is fairly limited. The cupcake, Mufsky Chernikov, flies diagonally upwards then smashes into the ground, leaving a slow-moving series of hitboxes that spread from him before he does the same diagonal jump again. My issue with this phase is twofold. First, the way that Mufsky moves makes it hard to both get close or to punish his attacks, leading to a lot of dead time compared to the other mini-bosses. The second and larger issue is that it's kinda hard to make out where the edges of these hitboxes land, especially when combined with Bon Bon's attacks. It can get pretty frustrating as the player has to keep more distance than they actually need. Cuphead usually provides an extraordinary visual clarity within its animation, but this is one of those few attacks that's just never read clearly to me. Interestingly, this mini-boss never shows up on the simple difficulty, but I've always thought the cupcake was about in the middle of the difficulty pack, with both the candy corn and the waffle being tougher foes. Up next is the Weasley Waffle, who flies around the screen randomly before pausing and exploding into damageable pieces before he continues flying around. Though the unpredictable movement does have the potential to lead to frustration, like with Beppi's car, the waffle always slows down for the moment right after it turns, meaning it never feels like she darts in random or unfair directions. There's also a lot of flexibility between the difficulty modes here. In simple, the waffle never explodes, and in expert, the cardinal directions explode at different times, leading to more time spent with more of the screen being dangerous, but less random movement. The biggest problem is that the projectiles go a little too far, often moving off screen, and thus not being able to be punished as I feel they're supposed to be, but there's nothing nearly as frustrating as the cupcake. The greedy Gumball is in the middle of the pack due to his simplicity. He runs to cut off most of the stage and then runs back and forth while raining gumballs down. It's a slightly more complicated version of Ollie Bulb's phase back against the root pack, but with the added complication of a mobile boss and the potential interference of Bon Bon on top of the attack, which works really well to make the game feel like it's evolving as you progress. Lord Gobpacker is another simple enemy, but with a much more unique premise than Gumball. Gobpacker follows the player, gaining 1 follower on regular and 2 on expert. He doesn't ever stop or use any other attacks, but the player needs to turn and attack him while they're moving away, which makes for a fun back and forth that encourages experimenting with other types of weapons. Roundabout, Chaser, and Spread work especially well, and now that the game's beginning to open up, a phase like this, where the pea shooter is violently outclassed, is great. Finally, the Conniving Candy Corn is the most complicated of the mini-boss fights, but is still a really satisfying mini-boss to master. There's 2 bosses in the game that feature mini-bosses prior to the boss proper, and the Candy Corn honestly fits in with the level of challenge that the second one has. The Conniving Candy Corn forms a figure 8 on the screen, only ever turning at one of the corners or the midpoint of the stage, flying around and releasing smaller candy corn enemies that fly directly upwards. This and Gobpacker are the best at using the platform on the stage to their advantage, using height to control Gobpacker's movement or to move around the candy corn, which gets really satisfying and plays with the environmental piece in a way that the other 3 bosses really don't. Bon Bon's interfering attacks are also pretty minimal. After one boss is beaten, she'll send jelly beans walking along the ground. They're slow moving, easy to predict, and don't have much health, but their small size means the player has to specifically duck to hit them unless they're using one of those aforementioned weapons. After 2 bosses are down, she'll pop up out of her castle and shoot a candy cane shotgun at the player, creating projectiles that are pretty easy to destroy but do take away the player's focus for a moment. They're small enough not to feel as frustrating as getting stuck between Beppi and the roller coaster, but just large enough that they can complicate mini-bosses in interesting ways. Once the final phase starts, the castle comes to life, turning into a moving hitbox as the screen begins to scroll to the left, forcing the player to keep on the run. Bon Bon starts to throw her head, sometimes 2 of her head, and they'll continually move towards the player, pausing intermittently, and occasionally she'll release a huge peppermint that rolls along the bottom of the screen but can be parried. On top of that, her hitbox is only her body, meaning the player needs to be on the candy platform or aiming to hit it with a pea shooter or, like Gobpacker, experimenting with mixing their weaponry. It's an intense phase, but I love how it all comes together. It works really well guiding the player in the more complicated fights that are still to come, while still having each attack be incredibly easy to understand. The mini-bosses are unique and also introduce the concept of mini-bosses prior to a boss proper, a concept featured in a major way in the game's penultimate fight. Now this doesn't necessarily affect my opinion of the game boss, but I also have to mention the Cuphead show's version of Bon Bon. She is so delightfully unhinged throughout the run of her entire episode, and the spindly design gets used to an amazing effect. I also love that the candy boss isn't an overweight slob, but instead this Marie Antoinette actress mix. Also, that's why her head keeps coming off. The wrongly attributed let them eat cake line combined with her head being less than tied to her shoulders is a fun design concept. Now this may be more love than a mini-boss gauntlet should have, but I think Baroness von Bon Bon earns an A grade. The animation is so much fun, and though I really don't like the cupcake as an enemy, it's not enough to ruin the rest of the battle. The death quote line has to go to Lord Gobpacker's "How's the jaw, old chum?" I just love how silly the suggested accent going on is, especially from this Pac-Man parody jawbreaker. The first bosses in Isle 2 are certainly tougher than most the Isle 1 foes, but even they pale before the boss that, prior to the DLC, won my vote for being the hardest fight in the game. Wally Warbles and Aviary Action. Specifically on Expert mode, this boss is a ridiculous challenge. He was the last boss I beat when I did my first Looper on Expert, and even this go around, the only bosses I died to more were in the DLC, which, for most of them, was the first time I'd ever fought them on Expert. Beating Chef Saltbaker on Expert for the first time took 8 tries in this run. I'm not going to tell you how many times it took Wally Warbles on my first, but I promise you it was way more than 8. Wally Warbles is a bird in a cuckoo clock, which is a bit of an obvious joke, but the fight ends up really taking advantage of the setup in some unexpected ways to push this joke to its limit. The first phase is pretty straightforward on the regular difficulty, but is proof as to how a single small detail can make an easy boss become a horrifying gauntlet. 3 things happen throughout this phase. These little nail birds appear at the same vertical level as the player, slowly flying across the screen, with the last one being parryable. These aren't too much of a risk on their own, but they do make moving around slightly more complicated, something necessary due to Wally's constant up and down movement. The other 2 things are Wally's direct attacks. He'll turn his head into a hand and shoot a few bullets in a predictable pattern that the player can slip through without much of a challenge. Finally though, he'll spit up eggs, usually a few in a row. When they hit the back of the screen, they'll explode into 3 eggshells that burst off into the main space of the fight. However, if you stay just above or below the egg, it can't hurt you on regular, encouraging the player to stay out of the central space of the arena. After all, that gives you the most space to dodge the finger gun and the nail birds, which is why Expert takes that away. The eggshell now breaks into 5 pieces, with one going directly up and the other directly down, which makes the entire screen become dangerous all the time. The player is constantly put into situations where they need to use their small form a lot more frequently, weaving around this huge barrage of eggs while still trying to keep pressure on Wally, who's been moving around and shooting more eggs in this almost non-stop onslaught. After dealing enough damage, Wally blows his top like a steam train. He's steaming mad after all, and starts a more traditional bullet hell phase. He stays in place, feathers fanning out and forcing the player to move slightly up and down. Small birds continue spawning here, and between bouts, Wally will reposition. Though it requires some solid focus, this phase always felt less intense than the one that came before, especially on the Expert difficulty. My favorite part of this phase, though, is how it sets up the fight's big punchline. Wally is shooting out his feathers, and at the end of the phase, falls out of his birdhouse completely naked, revealing his Machiavellian son as the next phase of the fight. Willy Warbles flies around in a figure 8 with a series of eggs around himself that bullets cannot get through. The eggs will spread away from him while spinning, then press tightly enough that only the dropped bomb splash damage is able to connect him. He'll occasionally pull out his gun and shoot a parryable shot. It's not too hard to deal with, but the movement of the eggs combined with his movement can get pretty bizarre to feel out. The music here also deserves a shout out. Around this point of the fight is also when the music decides to suddenly blast the main line from Flight of the Valkyries, which is such a bizarre and hilarious musical choice that lines up with an evil baby bird using a nest as a Koopa car to destroy you perfectly. Once Willy goes down, throwing his final temper tantrum, Wally makes a grand return, though he is still completely nude, missing teeth and in a stretcher guided by 2 nurses. This phase is just so funny to me. He's spitting up old and rotten food as a sentient garbage can. The nurses will spit up pills towards the player, and Wally can even spit up his own heart that attacks the player and moves his hitbox, which leads to Wally temporarily dying as his heart leaves his body, which is just so funny. And then when Wally finally goes down for the final time, the nurses turn on him, seasoning his body with salt and pepper while licking their lips. freaking gold. Though Wally on Expert is one of the most brutal bosses in the game, the story of this fight is one of my favorite yet. You face a bird, forcing it to lose its feathers in a home in desperation. Its son comes out of the destroyed nest, you beat it up, and then the bird returns despite his injuries and tries to keep fighting. It's funny, and it tells such a direct, clear cause and effect story through the mechanics and animation of the fight that it's just so memorable. There are so many visual gags throughout every single one of Wally's transformations. The music is spectacular, and that last phase, I just can't help but love everything about this fight. I think Wally handily earns a next S grade in my book. I think the Death Quote Award is going to go to the final phase. Even without my feathers, you're in for stormy weather. Wally's grin from the stretcher always makes me laugh here, and the fight's just so much fun. Though Wally pretty confidently holds the spot for the hardest boss on Expert for me, Grim Matchstick in Fiery Frolic was the first real wall that I, and it seems a lot of players, ran into on our first playthrough, which is a fitting role for the boss that serves as the final encounter of Isle 2. Grim not only has a decently complicated moveset, with a first phase focusing on overlapping attacks, a second phase that's hard to predict, and a third phase that requires some of the most accuracy with your shooting in the game thus far, but it does all of that while the player is also on constantly moving platforms with no floor below to catch them. On top of clouds pulling the player away from Grim in the first phase, Grim will occasionally wiggle his tail at the bottom of the screen, then burst it up a few moments later to create a wall. Then, of course, he combines it with his two other attacks. The first is Psybeams, the last of which is always parryable, and serves as the only parryable attack within the fight, meaning Grim is a really hard fight to get a perfect score on, especially depending on attack randomness. The other attack has Grim spit out a meteor that forms a sine wave, starting either going up or down, or occasionally having two meteors that cover a massive amount of space, especially when combined with an unfortunate tail placement. Even then, there's nothing too insane happening here. Attacks come out slowly and are all well telegraphed, which means the main challenge is making sure you're well enough positioned on the clouds to be able to dodge whatever it is that comes next. With the cloud's direction, this usually means that the player just needs to keep pressing forward and they're able to avoid running out of space. Phase 2 is the first jump in difficulty, and also my least favorite of his phases. Grim flies to the other side of the arena, which means the clouds now carry the player away from Grim, something that massively increases the challenge. With the right shot, like Bon Bon, this phase becomes a lot easier. Lauber especially is perfect here, but constantly having to turn and run to the right where flames have a chance to randomly jump can lead to really nasty situations. Grim extends his tongue along the ground, and these small flames wander across the bottom, a few occasionally jumping up. My biggest issue is that the direction and strength of these jumps is often unpredictable, and it's easy to dodge while expecting a flame to fly at you when it actually decided to go in a different direction that you end up dodging in before you realize where it's going to be. There are a few visual cues in terms of which flames won't jump and if they'll be jumping left or right, but those are all small enough that between the cloud movement and dodging the previous flame, they aren't visually clear. Some of them I didn't even realize until I looked up more details about this fight. But the third phase is Grim's notorious player killer. The player is still being pulled towards Grim as he turns into a Hydra. The moves themselves aren't too intense on their own, but in the moment, it can become a violently stressful phase. Each of the heads will randomly spit a slow-moving fireball, and if that fireball gets hit, it breaks into 4 projectiles in a plus shape, each moving faster than the fireball was moving. Combine this with the chaos of needing to be running from Grim while turning around and attacking and making sure you don't fall off the clouds, and it becomes really tough to avoid hitting these fireballs. Lobber, Charge, or Roundabout are all great here, though Roundabout will very reliably break the fireballs open, making it a lot riskier than the other two. Occasionally, the main head will turn into a flamethrower covering the middle of the screen. This section in particular really pushes the players towards Lobber, because it's effectively free damage with that weapon during one of the only times that you can easily attack. Grim is a hard fight, but I think it still manages to stay fair. The cloud pattern is always random, but there's always at least one cloud at any vertical level, meaning there's almost always somewhere to escape to, even if where you're escaping to isn't quite as good a place for dealing damage. Grim Matchstick is also a really unique boss on Expert. In addition to the increase to speed and health, the cloud direction changes, and this honestly makes Grim a lot easier. In the first phase, you're now having to run away from Grim, but with Roundabout not having the same minus as the small hitbox in phase 2 or risky fireballs in phase 3, it turns into a perfect weapon here. Then, with the clouds moving away from Grim in phase 2 and 3, everything is easier to handle. The fires aim either at the player or to the right, which means dodging in the same way you already need to move to to keep your positions is now safe, unlike in the regular version where you'd regularly put yourself back into danger dodging away. Then, in the last phase, it's so much easier to watch exactly where your shots are going to make sure you're breaking as few fireballs as possible, while still keeping on the pressure in a way that you really couldn't do on regular with how frequently you were turning back and forth. It's a bit of a strange change, and honestly always felt a little backwards to me. In terms of references, Grimm boasts somewhat of a Pete's Dragon-esque design, with a huge body boasting tiny wings and arms, especially when it combines with his personality, which features Grimm being a nervous wreck and boasting a stutter. This actually comes to the second part of the pun. Grimm Natwick was the designer of Betty Boop and Snow White, who was well known for having a stutter. Grimm Matchstick plays on the name with a little fire pun added in for dragon measure. My favorite death quote plays on this in Phase 2. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you in the hot seat. It's got a stutter and a pun, and the stutter kinda sounds like someone panting with the ha, which is potentially another pun on hot. I think Grimm Matchstick earns an A grade. There's a lot going on, and it's a demanding fight at the best of times. But the clouds never feel unfair in their placement, and the phases are all straightforward enough to stop it from feeling like a hindrance to the rest of the fight. Aisle 3, meanwhile, opens up with the game's other auto-scroller, Rumor Honeybottoms in Honeycomb Herald. She is also the only full boss encounter in the game that I actively dislike fighting. I'm gonna start with my biggest issue here, platforms. Whereas Grimm's battle is horizontal, Rumor's battle is vertical, and the platforms are spaced such that the player can jump up to 2 levels at a time. The screen moves about at the same speed, which, since the screen is shorter vertically, means the player's movement is a lot more limited here than it was with Grimm. But my big issue is the way that platforms spawn. As the pun of the level is built around Rumor being the queen bee, every platform is set at the base of a hexagon in the beehive office building. Except for when there isn't. There is no rhyme or reason to where there aren't platforms. Sometimes the entire screen is covered with platforms and there are no issues, whereas other times there are very few platforms around, massively restricting the player in terms of patterns they can use to dodge attacks or ways to follow after Rumor when she moves around. This is the only fight in the game where the random number generation ever made me pause the game, frustrated at how unlucky I had just gotten. Even when luck plays a huge part in what attack or mini-boss the player has to fight, the actual fight itself had never felt fully luck-based. On top of that, since you're always climbing up, unlike Grimm, where missing a convenient platform just meant you'd have to fall a little further, with Rumor it means you have to completely stop what you're doing and reorient yourself. To start off the Rumor Honeybottoms fight, Rumor leaves and calls the police on you instead. Worker bees occasionally fly around the space as a police bee flies in a straight line towards you, randomly stopping to drop a bomb that explodes a few seconds after into spikes, half of which can be parried. It's another phase like the cupcake that is just a little too simple for my taste, and it also has nothing to do with the rest of the fight's 2 big themes. He serves the queen bee, but it doesn't have anything to do with the magic transformation guidebook that leads the rest of it. This phase honestly feels like busy work. Once Rumor does appear, she has 3 magical attacks she rotates between. She either drops her head as a ball and chain before spitting bullets that ascend in an S-shaped pattern, summons 2 parryable orbs that follow the player for long enough that they'll bleed into the next attack, or summon 2 triangles that rotate and shoot off smaller parryable triangles. The difficulty of the spitting bullet attack is probably my favorite of the bunch. The unique hitbox she has, combined with a predictable movement, can be satisfying to move through, though it, like all the attacks, has the potential to be massively disrupted by bad platform luck. The other attacks are both okay, but pretty uninspired. Being attacked by a circle or a triangle, compared to some of the other visual chaos and beauty that bosses in Aisle 3 plan to unleash, just isn't exciting. And the circle lasting into the next phase has always felt more irritating than anything. In regular, she rotates through these 3 moves in a set order, where she alternates doing the chain and summoning every transformation on expert. This is also one of the easiest bosses to sequence break in the game. There's no damage gate between phase 2 and 3, which means that if the player is just able to get Rumor at the edge of phase 2 when she starts one of her transformations, then keeps on pressure through that and her transformation into the 3rd phase, it is incredibly easy to skip past the 3rd phase entirely. That said, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the 3rd phase is also her toughest phase, and often frustratingly so. After an incredibly long phase transition, which is a huge opportunity to deal damage, please bring spread shot. Once she transforms, she rests at the bottom of the screen as a plane, and only her face serves as the active hurt box. Fists fly out and home after the player, and I really wish that there was some visual cue before these spawned. As is, they'll appear and often spawn just above where Rumor is, making it easy to die to the spawn of the attack. Her other attack is a buzzsaw, covering most of the arena and forcing the player onto one side. This attack does leave plenty of time to get out of the way, but the biggest challenge here is finding a way to hurt the face. Outside of the final phase of Saltbaker, this is the only time in a non-plane boss fight that the target of the fight can be directly below the player permanently, and it doesn't feel great to aim at and fight. If you've done a lot of damage prior, this phase can end in almost an instant. Otherwise, it joins the first phase in feeling too long for its own good. As I mentioned, Rumor Honeybottoms is the only boss in Cuphead that I dislike. The randomness in the platforms is way more disruptive than the occasional misfortune facing Beppi, and there is a lot less charm and excitement within this fight to make up for what frustrations can exist. None of the puns or jokes go quite as far as the rest of the game too, which makes Rumor the only main boss in the game to earn a D grade. With that said, I do enjoy her final death quote, "Dominate and bominate. That's how I be." That's a pretty solid line. Next, we have, alongside Cagney, one of the only two bosses in the game that boasts only two phases. Captain Brinybeard in Shootin' and Lootin'. A visual mix of Bluto from Popeye and Davy Jones from the 1934 cartoon Davy Jones's Locker, Brinybeard opens with a phase that complicates as the player progresses through it. Throughout this entire fight, there is one constant: a barrel that moves its way across the entire top of the arena. When the player is underneath, it smashes down, staying inactive for a short time as it continues to move. The tell as to when it returns to aggression is incredibly easy to read at a glance, even when the fight is at its most chaotic. The first phase layers that threat with Brinybeard standing there and taking it like a champ. He has one attack at the start of the fight, pulling out a squid that shoots a few projectiles at an irregular tempo. Sometimes all the bullets come out at once, whereas sometimes he'll just stand there, holding the squid menacingly. In regular mode, only a random one of these projectiles will not be parryable, whereas in Expert, two of them won't be parryable. The long delay on the squid occasionally does feel like it can make for an awkward moment, as even when other attacks unlock, it stops him from doing much else. When the squid's not out, since the barrel needs to move across the entire stage, it often leads to long stretches where the player is just attacking Brinybeard at absolutely no risk. Though the fight does get busy, I feel it doesn't get quite hard enough to justify how much of a non-issue this opening phase is, which is why I believe Brinybeard is often seen by the community as one of the easier bosses on Aisle 3. After the first health gate, Brinybeard gains a whistle attack that summons one of three sea creatures, each of which attack in a unique way. The shark slams from the far side of the arena, covering most of it as it slides back away. Honestly, this works as a delayed press-in to push the player in towards the ship, which can also make dodging the barrel or eventually ship attacks more complicated. And though it can't get complicated if Brinybeard decides to pull out the squid right after, I've never personally seen it come out fast enough to be a problem. You can technically kill the shark too, but it's usually gone fast enough that I don't really see the point. The second sea creature, the purple squid, is something that it makes a lot more sense to target. When it rises up, it starts flinging ink projectiles around the dock. When the player is hit by one, they won't take damage, but they do get inked. It's not too bad on regular, but on Expert, it massively hinders visibility. So keeping pressure on Brinybeard while also dodging the damageless ink, or killing the squid while avoiding Brinybeard ends up being the major choice here. I like this complication a lot. It doesn't deal damage, so the hard to dodge nature never feels unfair. The last sea creature is a parade of dogfish, hilariously animated as literal dogs. They leap up out of the water deceptively high and then slide along the dock. This does end up with the same kind of threat as the next attack that's getting added in, which makes this often feel underwhelming. That said, it's also the only attack alongside Brinybeard's hand squid that's able to get the player to move away from Brinybeard for a moment. If the player is able to mess with the barrel, other attacks never really do anything to stop the player from being fully aggressive with the spread shot. So it ends up helping keep the fight engaging overall, even if the initial jump is more of a threat than the slide across the dock. After the final health gate, the ship begins to join in, chewing cannonballs like gum that it spits regularly along the bottom of the arena. Honestly, this is one of my favorite phase complications. It adds just the right amount of visual noise while still being charming and building towards the final phase, and the attacks are regular enough that they serve as a constant problem while not ever trapping the player. At the end of the first phase, the ship screams, throwing Brinybeard off and into the ocean. The ship looks huge and impressive here, but the best part about this is Brinybeard falling into the ocean in the distance, which just kills me every time. Brinybeard is also unique in being the only boss in the game not to be the focus of his own final phase. Brinybeard has nothing to do with the end of this fight. He stays there in the ocean, whereas even bosses like Wally Warbles who leave are still the final threat in their own battle. The ship keeps the barrel moving and swaps between two attacks, shooting out spheres in a strange circular pattern that's hard to read at first but easily exploitable, or a giant laser beam that honestly feels "I'm a fire in my laser" reminiscent, that stays on screen for a long time. The pattern is satisfying to learn, and being able to stay close enough to use spread while dodging is ridiculously satisfying. The laser feels unfair at first, as I thought you'd always have to fake out the barrel before ducking underneath, but here's a fun fact. You can dash while ducking. Nothing is stopping you from just getting out of the way, and that means you can fake out the barrel to stay pressed in, or just need enough space that you can still dash to dodge it. Once you've learned that, the phase leans towards too simple. Having not touched the game since the DLC released almost 3 years ago, a couple bosses took a while to relearn. But Brinybeard died on the first try on regular and the second try on expert. He feels like a step down from some of the Isle 2 bosses overall, even if the fight still works well. Personally, I think Brinybeard earns a B grade. Though he presents far more of a threat than Goopy did and doesn't have anything he does wrong, he ends up feeling like a standard or expected boss fight. There's no chaotic mechanics to learn, and nothing is huge in terms of spectacle or story as some of the other easier Isle 3 boss fights. In terms of his death quotes, Brinybeard will sadly lose to his ship's heartfelt and engaging quote, "Ha ha ha, ha ha." He's got a cute buried treasure line, but I love it when the usual joke is twisted like it is, with the ship literally just laughing at you for dying. There are 2 plane levels in Inkwell Isle 3, the first of which is Cala Maria in High Seas Hijinks, a Betty Boop-inspired mermaid/Medusa creature. Her name serves as somewhat of a calamari pun, but I've seen a lot more theories about other levels of pun that may exist within the name. Cala Maria is a genus of snakes, which might be hinting towards the Medusa part of her design, and Cala Maria is also a suburb in Greece, which, especially with her accent in the Cuphead show being Greek, might have been an intentional pun there, especially with Medusa being a Greek myth. The Greek connections go even further than that, though, as her body turns to stone at the end of the second phase, specifically into the pose of the Venus de Milo, a famous Greek statue, especially once the arms fall off the body first to leave her in the same state that we found the statue in. All that aside, her characterization is also absolutely iconic. She's constantly flirting with Cuphead, exerting herself with attacks, turning her face into a bullhorn, doing this little arm wiggle thing when she goes underwater. She gets shocked when she loses her grip on the fishes she uses as a weapon, and the octopus that forms her hair coming back to life whenever she summons more animals is just, it's always been hilarious to me. Her fight also evolves and progresses in a great way. At the beginning of the fight, her design focuses on overlapping attacks even more than a lot of earlier bosses. She summons a creature to help, then does an attack herself to bombard you with 2 threats at a time. There are 3 sea creatures. Pufferfish, which I find the easiest to deal with, travel the screen vertically. Some can be parried, and all of them die to just a few hits of damage, which means using the bomb to clear a path is heavily rewarded, and it provides plenty of chances to charge up your super meter. Next is a turtle that moves forward, stopping 3 times to shoot out a spread shot. I find that this is either a non-issue in terms of combining with Kala's other attacks, or creates a brutal onslaught. The last animal is the strangest of the bunch. A seahorse, literally, using his lifesaver to stay afloat, starts to spit water upwards while moving towards the player. This doesn't do any damage, but pushes the player upwards whenever they're in the water stream, which can either be a total non-issue or the most dangerous of the animals, depending on the attack it mixes with. Cala Maria herself either blows out a few groups of ghosts that rush towards the player, or dives underwater to pull out a red or yellow fish. The red fish creates waves of bullets, some of which are parryable that the player has to dodge through. Both it and the ghosts are pretty simple overall. The most dangerous has always felt like the yellowfish, especially on Expert. It shoots an electric dolphin that tracks the player's path very quickly, and on Expert, she shoots 2 of them. This combines really brutally with the turtle and seahorse, even though the attack itself is fairly simple. Even more so because the yellow and red fish both jump out of Cala Maria's hands as a huge damage box at the end of the attack, which means the player can really not reliably dodge anywhere in half of the screen, well tracked by 2 fast-moving obstacles and dodging bullets. Though there are these occasionally frustrating pairings, I still love the design of these simple attacks overlapping to create complicated and dynamic patterns. It helps keep the fight fresh regardless of how many times the player dives in, and each attack is simple enough to understand that, having made it to Isle 3, the main threat is being overwhelmed. The threats also work with her hurt box really well. Only her face takes damage, meaning the player's goal is to minimize their vertical movement. Meanwhile, every single attack encourages vertical dodging. Entering into her second phase, Cala Maria is flanked by 2 electric eels that bite her hips, shocking her and waking up the snakes on her head to reveal her true nature as Medusa. I love the scream and animation of this phase change, it is hilarious to me, and the phase serves as a great contrast to the first. Electric eels begin to emerge from the water around her, each spitting out bullets. A few aren't a problem, but in a horde, they absolutely cover the screen with damage, which ties really well well with Cala Maria, only taking damage on her head. The player can use their attacks and supers to keep the eels at bay, meaning the bullets are less intense. Meanwhile, Cala Maria introduces the attack that defines her second and third phase, a green wave that covers most of the screen, petrifying the player. They can't shoot, they can't dodge, and they can't move. But once they press 22 buttons, they're able to move again, meaning the way to react is mashing violently. Ironically, I often find myself getting hit right after I unfreeze, throwing myself into a projectile more than actually being hit while frozen. There's also a great skill ceiling here. The gaze beam doesn't hit a player in the corner next to Cala Maria's face, but that's a horrible spot to be in to dodge the eels. Keeping the eels in check in order to make the gaze nothing but a stalling tactic, or to be able to dodge more reliably in this corner, is incredibly satisfying, and it introduces the gaze as a mechanic without it being too intense. The final phase is the one that has the greatest potential for frustration, but also feels like a really good climax to the encounter. Her body, as I mentioned prior, turns to stone, and her head begins to float into a reef, limiting the player to about a third of the screen at a time, a little bit less on expert. There are 3 threats here. The first being a new variation of her gaze attack. This time it comes out just in front of her face, meaning the player can push right up against her to avoid it, but that makes it harder to dodge her 2 more traditional attacks. The first being occasional vertical pillars, cutting the already restrictive space even further down, and easily trapping the player into damage if they stay too far back to avoid the gaze. The other attack are these toxic bubbles, which move forward abnormally slowly while also moving vertically to try to catch a player. This is the one place where luck can feel like it occasionally enters the equation, often working alongside the pillars to form a wall that the player doesn't have time to weave past before Cala Maria sends out her next freezing gaze. But it's never enough to ruin the phase for me. The entire fight feels like it progresses through this story as the sea animals are chased away and Cala Maria becomes more and more feral and monstrous as she tries to escape. Overall, I think Cala Maria is another S-grade boss. She's iconic for a reason. Her fight evolves from this chaotic mess to a clear, unique, and characterizing threat in a battle with a ton of animation Easter eggs, a great soundtrack, and generally exciting story thread, which makes it feel satisfying all the way through. Her death quotes are another batch that aren't my favorite, which seems to be a pattern in IL3, but I think I'd give it to Holy Mackerel! Is that your best effort? Mostly because I enjoy saying Holy Mackerel. Oftentimes, when I hear people discuss boss difficulty, when the easiest boss in IL3 comes up, Sally Stageplay in Dramatic Fanatic often enters into the conversation. And though I do think that she, Brinybeard, and Werner Wermin all have a shot at the title, that's never held Sally back as an encounter for me in the way it seems to hold her back for others. Namely, because Sally features one of my personal favorite battle narratives. I've mentioned it in a few other fights going through all of my boss analysis series, but one of my favorite parts of a multi-phase boss fight is the progression of story throughout each phase. How the progression in the fight becomes more than a gameplay challenge, but an evolution of the themes of the fight, both aesthetic and metaphorically. Slave Knight Gale renewing his sanity to change the tempo of the boss fight, or one of my other favorite examples that I haven't spoken of yet, Kefka at the end of Final Fantasy VI, a boss that uses 4 phases to invoke an ascension from hell to purgatory to heaven to Kefka himself, who has now deigned himself as a god above it all. Though Cuphead doesn't exactly try to reference Dante's Inferno in the same way, my favorite boss fights makes it feel like you're going through an animated short film. And Sally uses the theater gimmick and combines it with my personal favorite hidden phase in the game to an extraordinary effect. The fight begins with Cuphead interrupting Sally Stageplay's wedding, or at least the performance of her wedding. She destroys her wedding dress while the priest and groom panic in the background. Then, as the first phase ends, she drives away with her groom, becoming a stay-at-home mother as her 2 children join in the fight and her husband puts on a sweater. After that ends, the fight evolves to a giant cardboard version of her using announced cardboard attacks, a phase that also ends up being very intentionally evocative of Final Fantasy boss design with the way attacks are called. Then, finally, with her Deus Ex Machina destroyed, she comes out for her bows, the cast bowing in the background, while the audience throws roses on stage. It just feels like a complete package. But the fight can also go in a completely different direction. If you stand on these cherubs in the first phase, an activity I have a bizarrely hard time doing when I'm not playing as Miss Chalice, then the chandelier in the background falls and kills her husband. She cries over his body, before moving to a nunnery, where nuns throw rulers at the player while the priest watches from the bushes instead. Then, a cardboard version of her husband joins her in an even more direct visual nod to Kefka, plus the angel of the child they never had occasionally spins out to send a saw blade along the ground to damage you, on top of everything else. Then, for the bows, only the priest and nun appear, the baby never having had a real role, and the husband being dead. This entire fight's premise is just one of my favorites. Even before talking about gameplay, the setting and the way it ties its secret path into the game is incredible. This is my personal favorite secret phase in the game, even though it took me way more tries than I'd like to admit to learn how to reliably get onto those cherubs as Mugman. There are also a ton of great details, like the audience applauding in the foreground or the asbestos safety curtain, that I just adore here. As I mentioned earlier, the difficulty is the one place the fight lingers. The first and second phases of the fight are very similar, with Sally teleporting away in her parasol to slam down or jumping into the air to either spin towards the player or throw a fan that will linger on the ground for a short time. She also does a slow-blown kiss that exists more as a way to reach the cherubs or get some parries than as an actual threat. When she evolves to the second phase, she stops throwing the fan and starts generating these mice toys that crawl along the edges of the screen before dropping back on the player once they're above them. It does work really well to keep the stage busier, but it's still pretty simple compared to a lot of the other bosses in Aisle 3 that utilize unique mechanics to differentiate themselves. The third phase is probably the one that suffers the worst from the difficulty. She either spawns lightning that a player needs to dodge around, or spawns a meteor followed by a big wave. The meteor can be broken open for a parryable star, allowing the player to get over the wave, but if the player equips Smoke Dash, they can just go through the big wave instead, meaning the only attack that the player ever needs to react to is lightning. In the fourth phase, hitting Sally can be occasionally frustrating. Her location in Aisle 3 often leads to her being one of the last bosses in the game, which means despite the fact that she's flying around the top of the arena while roses fall and the umbrella spins, it's still pretty easy to find a weapon that works well against her. Even with that disappointing difficulty, I still adore this fight. I also want to give a shout out to her song. Just after 2 minutes of music, of course, Christopher Madigan provides an extended series of drum solos to a tap dancer, and it's incredible. This jazz tap solo makes this one of my favorite tracks from the game that I'll often just listen to on my own, and it is an absolute tragedy that most players will just never reach this section. Though I do wish she was tougher, I cannot give Sally lower than an S grade. This fight is just so charming to me with so many details and jokes in the background and animations. I think my favorite quote goes to Phase 3 though, because it forces the rhyme so hard in such an endearing way. Good riddance, go away, it's time for my soliloquy. Of course, without the rhyme and pronouncing words correctly, you should be pronouncing it as good riddance, go away, it's time for my soliloquy. The forced rhyme is just so funny to me, and it really matches well with the ridiculousness of the death picture. The first of two evil scientists on Aisle 3, Werner Wermin in Marine Corps, is a Tom and Jerry reference put onto a German mad scientist boasting another absolutely ridiculous series of puns and jokes. Werner rides down in a hollowed out soup can that, legally, is not Campbell's, shooting pieces of junk from a trebuchet or literal cherry bombs that hit the ground and shoot fireballs along the ground in a straight line. The cherry bombs are one of my favorite attacks to weave around, especially on Expert. Occasionally, he'll charge across the arena, forcing the players to either use parryable springs or the smoke dash. At the end of the phase, Werner moves to the center of the arena trying to set off a rocket that backfires and falls into his soup can, blowing it up, destroying his cigar, and leaving him beaten and scarred. Werner keeps fighting, however, moving between two vertical levels and using flamethrowers to cover one of the two floors. Bottle caps on the side also spinning at random, with the player dodging around them to position themselves well. Unlike other centrally located bosses, Werner actually still uses the whole stage, allowing players to move under or above him, and sometimes forcing them to when the entire wall of bottle caps decides to spin. Eventually, as Werner's tank breaks again, a giant cat breaks through the wall and eats him. Before I mention the third phase, I need to start going over all the details within this fight. The entire battle, the player could spot the cat moving around in the background trying to find a way in. On top of that, two of the medals on the side can be identified as Austrian and British war medals, which is where the connection between Tom and Jerry was made to a German mouse driving a tank. In World War I, German soldiers were referred to as Jerrys, and British soldiers were referred to as Tommies. On top of that, one of Germany's more well-known tanks in World War II was the, and please pardon my inability to speak German, Panzerkampfwagen Maus. Maus, of course, is German for mouse, hence the German Jerry riding a mouse, a tank, before the Tommy, Tom the cat, enters the fight near the end. All the bottle caps also refer back to Cuphead's world and parody soda brands. King Cola dances between King Dice, King Kong, and King Cola in a great way, while Inkwell Soda just matches with the vibe of the world. Once the cat, Katzenwagen, which is German for cat cart, a pun that makes sense once you know how the phase ends, breaks through the back wall, he either vibes to the music or alternates between two attacks. He reaches a paw to the side, growing unnaturally as it slaps across the arena, causing a cascade of wood pieces to fall in the opposite direction as the players chase to one side of the arena, then back towards the center of the room. This entire attack is very inspired by the Cheshire Cat in the Adventures of Batman and Robin for the Genesis, though it never gets to quite the level of claustrophobia that boss trying to invoke. Then he occasionally does whatever that was, and spawns mice ghosts that throw orbs at the player that explodes like the cherry bombs did back in the first phase. But this time, some of the projectiles are parryable. The ghosts can be killed with a little focus, as the orbs overlap with the rest of Katzenwagen's attacks, which can make the entire fight become very hectic. Once you beat this phase, the game refers back to the Cheshire Cat one more time, as the cat's face falls off and onto the ground, revealing that it's been a robot the whole time. But in the case of Werner Wermin though, it turns out he's still been the boss the whole time, piloting the cat by entering via the mouth. This is just such a cute and absurd little end to the fight, and also serves as a great callback to a game that inspired the designers, making for a fight with a great feeling of progression as you destroy each and every one of Wermin's creations. Though it doesn't boast the same kind of secret phase detail that Sally does, the scale of the fight and the detail of the shifting backgrounds means, like Sally, I'm able to look past the difficulty and appreciate the charm that exists in this fight. At the end of the day, I am a sucker for a fight that feels like it's operating on cartoon logic, and Werner Wermin feels like a Tom and Jerry storyline as this mouse keeps using more and more deadly machines to try and come out on top. I think he earns another S grade. My favorite deathline goes to his second phase, mostly because I look at it and I hear it being screamed by an Austin Powers villain. This tank is the ultimate weapon. You will not win. Accents manifested in text via changing letters is one of my favorite writing tropes, and this line gives me more evil scientist vibes than the actual evil scientist that we'll be looking at next. And that other scientist is, of course, the base game's final full-playing boss, Dr. Kahl's robot in Junkyard Jive. When it comes to boss design, Dr. Kahl and his robot have what I believe is the single most complicated boss phase in the game, as well as what's often considered one of the longest and most grueling phases in the game. You start facing the robot, who has 3 attacks that are constantly going and overlapping with each other. A huge laser beam from his antenna will target the player and stop bullets from passing through, while a device will come out of his chest and push across the screen, making a screen-wide laser until that generator is parried. From his stomach, a series of Space Invader-esque machines will snake their way up the screen. On its own, just 3 attacks isn't any more complicated than any of the other bosses we've seen, but all 3 of the sources of these attacks have their own individualized health bars, and once they're defeated, they'll switch to an alternative attack that continues to overlap with the other surviving attacks, or any attacks that you've already adjusted. Once the antenna is destroyed, the robot tilts its head back and starts to shoot a wave of bolts at a consistent rate. This now serves as a constant threat, though it's not quite as disruptive as the major laser could be in the occasions it went off. Once the chest is destroyed, the robot begins to use his arms to do one of 2 attacks: a magnet in the bottom corner that pulls the player towards it, or arms that cut through the center of the screen, pulling back and releasing vertical energy bullets out. The retracting arms are much more of a problem, namely because there's no warning when the vertical bullets shoot out, meaning that they'll cut the player's space in half and then often prove hard to avoid when combined with other attacks. Finally, when the bottom compartment breaks, large bombs home towards the player incredibly accurately. The player will need to destroy these eventually, which explode with a long lingering radius, or it will hit the player. Interestingly, the health of the bombs are actually increased in simple mode, making it harder to accidentally blow up the bombs. Once all 3 of the pieces are destroyed, the automation's heart is revealed, forcing the player to deal with all 3 of the new attacks at once. At this point, only the heart takes damage, but it also has a great visual that it begins to get burnt and covered with ash once its health has been reduced by about half. I love how the entire first phase comes together. The variable nature of how to approach the fight, the chaos of the attacks, it all feels great. Using the bomb to spread damage between 2 health bars, and the fact that every threat that the robot offers feels like it needs to be taken seriously, goes a long way to make this phase feel like it belongs on the culmination of the plain bosses that come before. The second phase is my least favorite. The robot breaks apart and the head rockets off screen. It begins to fly back and forth, with more of those bombs spawning with each cross of the screen. The issue is that the head moves fast enough that you spend most of the fight with the head either to the left of the player, and thus not interactable, or off screen. Having a super can skip most of the fight, which does help a lot, mostly because then you don't have to interact with this phase at all. Not because it's particularly challenging, but it's just really boring. His final phase, of course, is somewhat notorious. Dr. Kahl starts to pilot his robot and embodies his inner Dr. Eggman, pulling out huge gemstones that shoot projectiles in spinning waves. Some of the projectiles are parryable, but the entire screen gets absolutely covered, with only a few small moments of reprieve between barrages to recover. Now, the pellets on their own would be too challenging, but they also combine with moving walls that force the player into a small portion of the screen, especially on Expert, which leaves effectively no space to squeeze through. There is a satisfying rhythm to be found within the pellets, and moving through this attack and keeping the pressure on, though overwhelming at first, is one of the most satisfying phases to pull off once you know how to handle it. The one minus about this phase is, and this is one of the only times you'll hear me say this in either of these Cuphead videos, is that the foreground art isn't particularly great. It's well drawn and it looks cool, but it blocks visibility a lot, and when you combine a tight space with hard to predict bullets and remove the player's ability to see, that has the potential to get frustrating fast. Especially since this phase makes up just over half the boss's health and lacks the potential of double hits that the first phase had, small things like lack of visibility can appear multiple times within a single boss fight. Once you know what to expect, it is still technically dodgeable, and the great moveset can start to shine again, but the lack of visibility just feels unintentional from a design standpoint. It also uses its music incredibly effectively. Junkyard Jive is an intentionally repetitive piece of music, but that ends up meshing with the fight really well, especially in the third phase where the player is fully drawn into dodging a single attack. The repeating melody of dun 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 really helps to keep the tension of the fight at an absolute peak. I absolutely adore the first phase, and I think the third phase is one of the most satisfying challenges the game presents. But that lackluster second phase and frustrating visibility in the third means I can't give it the highest honors, so he instead sits within the A grade. For the best death line, I have to go with, "I have the perfect equation to hinder your evasion." Not because it's particularly great, but because the others are just the robot talking, and that's not as entertaining to me as things like Brinybeard's chip laughing maniacally. Like with Cagney Carnation and Grim Matchstick, Aisle 3 presents a boss clearly designed to be the last obstacle before entering Inkwell Hell and taking down the final two bosses, being the Phantom Express and Railroad Wrath. And this is another fight that I absolutely adore. Rather than a single enemy with an evolving move set like most of the bosses in Cuphead, the Phantom Express ends up more similar to the Root Pack. Each phase is a different ghost riding the express, with the player moving their way up the train as they beat each phase. Throughout the entire fight, the player is on a small platform on an adjacent track, and by parrying the wheels on either side, they're able to move left to right. The fight complicates this with flying minions, pumpkins in the first and second round, and ghosts in the third, with the pumpkins returning for the final phase in Expert mode. Pumpkins carry parryable bricks and drop them whenever they're over one of the wheels, forcing your cart to move, whereas ghosts home towards the player, dropping a parryable spirit upon death that does the same thing. The mechanic here is easy to understand, provides a ton of opportunities to parry or push the player to use positioning to their advantage, and it allows simple phases to become much more interesting. The first phase immediately benefits from this unique mechanic. The blind ghost has only one attack, shooting eyes from his hands that bounce to the left, forcing the player to destroy them or dodge around them. With the ghost taking up a third of the screen, only the left and middle positions are safe to stand in, and with the eyes coming out of his hand near the middle of the screen, the player usually wants to stay to the far left, meaning they have to handle the pumpkins alongside dealing with the barrage of eyes and keeping pressure on the boss. Simple, but satisfying. Cuphead at its best. The Blind Spectre also does a great job setting up the design concept of this boss fight. Without losing the goofy charm that Cuphead keeps, the Phantom Express feels like a step up from the bosses that came before. This feels like the final boss you need to beat before you enter the Devil's Domain, even just looking at the color palette and designs. The second phase is a giant skeleton, which wears its inspiration from the iconic skeleton dance on its sleeve, albeit with a cute conductor hat on to match the vibe. The conductor pops his head out of one car and his hands through the top of the others, slamming the hands down and covering most of the space that a platform can rest in. Your platform being under one of these hands isn't confirmed damage though. The player can stay right at the edge of the cart to avoid taking damage, following the head as it and the hand swap locations between every attack can provide the players huge windows. When the player is in control, the boss feels completely unthreatening. But as soon as the player loses control, it feels like there is nowhere safe to stand. That's a design concept carried on to the third phase when two pistons, lightning-breathing lollipop spheres? I'll be honest, I'm not sure what these are supposed to be, but two of them burst out of the cars on the train and start dancing together. This phase swaps the pumpkins for Ghost, which combine in a really threatening way with the plate's main attack, breathing lightning that starts a small length away from the wall and forces a player to the far side if they aren't hiding in that small space between where the attack starts and the wall. However, if the player is standing there, they'll find the ghosts particularly threatening, as it ends up very hard to get rid of the ghosts early enough without risking accidentally moving your platform directly into the lightning. Those plates don't have much health, especially if the player uses spread or crackshot supers to take one of them completely out of the picture right away. Like the conductor, this phase goes from absolutely fine to out of control really quickly in a really satisfying way. And the game's design here encouraging using single card supers over saving up for a super art by having health bars that don't go from boss to boss are really welcome at the end of the game, where the player is invited to start learning how to maximize their damage output before they enter expert mode. Finally, the locomotive comes to life, gets onto all fours, and starts to gallop away from the rest of the train. On expert, the pumpkins do return here, but the only attack that the train uses is spitting out a circle of bones that will go downwards until it reaches the same vertical level as the player, and then fly horizontally across the screen at that level. The train's invincible at first, until the player parries its tail/light bulb, which opens access to its heart and causes a barrage of fireballs to begin flying down towards the player. Once it closes, the train goes back to having almost no physical threat as the player positions and tries to finish it off. I love the progression of this fight. Moving your way up the train and facing the ghosts along the way, combined with the scale of all the bosses, makes the Express feel like a major threat, even if the movesets excel through their simplicity. The platform interacts really well with every single phase, and the addition of the minions provides an excellent complication that makes every phase more interesting. It also serves as a second immediate reference to Final Fantasy VI, to the famous Phantom Train, an iconic level where the player fights their way up to the front of a haunted train before facing down the locomotive at the end. The Phantom Express is an S-grade boss fight. Every phase is satisfying to learn, feels like a climax, and the theme of the fight is Cuphead at its best. Every ghost's design is really fun, even if I still don't know what those things are supposed to be, and it really builds to a great finale for IL-3. Every death quote here is great because it's just the ghosts telling you that you're going to die, but I have to give it to the locomotive because it just sums up the fight and its vibe so incredibly well, really capturing that 1930s spooky energy. What a glorious night for me to bring the fright. Oh boy, this is gonna be a long entry. Before the player gets to take on the devil himself, they have to take down his right-hand man, King Dice in All Bets Are Off. The only two bosses that are built up in any way prior to their fights in the base game are King Dice and the devil, and they both pay off pretty well. This is the longest fight in the game by a major margin. So long that it's balanced around the player getting healed throughout the fight. Rather than facing King Dice, the player lands in the middle of a game, rolling dice via parrying to advance 1, 2, or 3 spaces, and the player can control the timing of the dice once they've figured it out. Each number on the board represents a different mini-boss, with one in each set being required before the player eventually reaches King Dice. On top of that, a random one of the 3 bosses within each section has a heart, healing the player 1 hit point whenever they enter that specific mini-boss. There's also a start over square, but that doesn't respawn any mini-bosses, meaning the player still has a safe path throughout, assuming they can correctly control the dice. The boss rush vibe of this encounter also makes this a great penultimate moment, making King Dice feel like an absolute scumbag as he confidently mocks the player while throwing minion after them. It makes King Dice and the devil feel like they're providing massively different, completely unique threats. So now it's time to run through King Dice's court. The first boss is also the only boss I can't reliably no-hit among the 9, the Tipsy Troupe. I've heard most people find this boss easy, but my brain just refuses to operate here. There are 3 drinks named by the art book as Jeanette, Olethan, and Romulus. Jeanette clones the green olive on her toothpick, which grows into an eyeball with wings that flies around, occasionally shooting projectiles. Olethan occasionally falls over, covering the bottom of the screen with damage that needs to be jumped over, while Romulus will occasionally blow his top, causing rum to drop directly down onto the player's location. None of these moves are hard to dodge in a vacuum, but the challenge I've always found is that the tells for the attack aren't near where Cuphead is, so I need to watch the troop, but that means I'm not watching where I'm going. Once one of the drinks goes down, the rest of the fight is effectively free, but that first phase has a lot of attacks that feel random and sporadic. Next up is Chips Bettigan, a stack of poker chips with a cowboy vibe. Chips is constantly whooping and yee-hawing as he bounces up and down. I love the intro to this fight of King Dice stacking chips into existence. It really helps King Dice feel present in the encounter. Only Chips' face here takes takes damage, but he takes long enough between attacks that it's pretty easy to punish. After bouncing for a short time, Chips spreads out and moves across the arena, with the player needing to dodge through the gaps in the chips. How much of a challenge this actually poses is pretty RNG dependent. Some patterns barely require the player to jump, whereas others require a couple of precise jumps and dodges to get around, especially on Expert. Though there can be bouts of bad luck, this is usually the boss I go for in the first set if I didn't bring the smoke dash. The final of the first trio is Mr. Wheezy, who's the boss I usually go for if I did have that smoke dash equipped, since that charm gets rid of the most significant threat that he presents. Mr. Wheezy's fight takes place in 2 ashtrays with a pit between them, and has another great intro with King Dice lighting him up. He sits in one of the ashtrays, spitting a few spinning fireballs that are hard to predict at first, but move pretty slowly, and they even have blind spots where the player can stay completely stationary and not need to worry. After he spits a few fireballs out, he'll turn to ash and pop up in the other tray, forcing the player to leap over. Devil's cigarettes fly up in the middle of the screen, meaning jumping through can be fairly precise in the short window the player has to get away from Mr. Wheezy. Unless, of course, you have the smoke dash, in which case the fireballs are the only thing that pose any kind of threat to the player. Once he goes down, he also has my favorite death animation of the bunch, as King Dice puts him out with his heel. It's also one of my favorite stages to make use of your death invulnerability, because you can duck behind the boot stomp or you can bounce in the fire as you wait. Starting off the second set of bosses is Pip and Dot, a domino duet riding a swing with the top sporting a stovepipe hat and the one on the bottom wearing heels. They shoot each other a flirty glance before they start their machine pulled straight from Saw up. The floor constantly pulls towards a wall of spikes, with huge sections of that floor being covered in spikes as well. The player ends up pretty restricted in terms of movement, especially when 2 long spike sections spawn back to back, though it never has the chance to feel as unusually precise as Chips had the potential to. On top of that, Pip will occasionally raise his hat, spawning a domino bird thing that flies around the edge of the arena, closing the space even further. Or both open their surprisingly toothy maw to spit out D20s that bounce across the arena, a few of which can be parried. It all works together to really make the player feel claustrophobic. Though the fight's intimidating for a new player, it's actually pretty simple overall once you stay calm. This fight usually ends up being the battle in the second set that I play through. Next up is Hoppus Pocus, who boasts the most groan-worthy pun for a name among King Dice's court in the best way possible. King Dice is back for this intro before Hoppus starts to alternate between 2 attacks. Like old Wheezy, whether or not the player has Smoke Dash completely changes the difficulty level of this fight. Hoppus summons rabbit skulls that spin around the player, stopping with a single opening as they press towards them. Though most directions are perfectly fine to dodge, the diagonal downward gaps are where the challenge comes in, requiring some really precise maneuvering. With the Smoke Dash, however, the player's response, regardless of the direction of the opening, is just to press dash through the threat and keep attacking. Other than that, Hoppus summons bubble card suits at the top or bottom of the screen, with the heart suit always being parryable. If the bubbles are at the bottom of the screen, it's simple to land on the parry, but jumping up into parries has always been a much tighter task. On top of that, this boss fight is an absolute nightmare for Miss Chalice, who parries by dashing horizontally. I haven't personally fought Hoppus using Miss Chalice, but since the player can't parry these, I imagine a perfectly timed invincibility roll is the only way to get through damageless. The sixth and final of the second set of bosses is Fearlap, who also serves as one of the 2 plain mini-bosses among the court. Fear is a skeleton horse watching a horse race below him, with his name being a reference to Farlap, an Australian racehorse from the late 1920s. The blue ghost racers will rise up towards the player once they go beneath you, and Fear will regularly shoot out presents that fly forward, then explode into a ring of horseshoes. This is also a theory, but the horse movement in the race feels like somewhat of a reference to A Horse in Motion, the 1878 series of pictures some film historians consider the first film. Like Dr. Kahl, Fearlap has a busy foreground that often obscures what's happening on screen, though it feels a lot more intentional here than it did with Dr. Kahl. Projectiles all have a very predictable pattern, and the player has more space to move around and dodge things. Though I like Dr. Kahl more, I think this is the better use of a busy foreground. Personally, I think the second set of 3 bosses is the most challenging, as there aren't any completely free bosses among them like in the other sets. And I think the middle of these 3 sets, being the hardest bosses, does a great job making the fight take shape as you build towards your confrontation with the king. Starting the final set is Pure Roulette, whose name and death screen combine really well. She's a roulette wheel that dances, specifically pirouetting as she moves across the screen, but her death screen defines her style as Russian, which is a reference to Russian-style ballet literally, but also means she's a Russian roulette, which ties well with her roulette attack being a collection of projectiles with a single single one missing, which implies an empty chamber. Very clever, Cuphead. Outside of that raining projectile attack, Pirouette dances back and forth across the arena. With the smoke dash, the player can just move through, though without it, this attack is a balancing act of flipping these parryable poker chips to jump over her. But the chips don't stay flipped for long, and Pirouette can delay moving across the stage. It's satisfying, though Smoke Bomb being so encouraged makes her somewhat underwhelming when you have it. But the 8th boss is... well, I don't know how to describe him. Some bosses are so oppressive, so overwhelming that they're impossible to put into words. There are so many attacks that are already insane to learn, and then you imagine adding minions on top of that. That kind of fight is absolutely brutal. Thankfully, Mangosteen is not that fight, though he holds a similar honor to fights like Miss Noble do as the official punching bags of their game. With that said, I can say pretty definitively, Mangosteen is harder than Miss Noble, so he's got that going for him. He watches the player for a while, then shoots a single tracking projectile that's pretty well telegraphed. There's also chalk blocks that jump across the screen in an arc, and sometimes the player might even need to get out of their way. Compared to even Isle 1 bosses, Mangosteen is comically simple, and feels honestly out of place as one of the final bosses. That said, I usually fight him on my runs because it's pretty easy and this fight's long. Especially if you have the spread shot, this fight is pretty free. Also, why does he have teeth? I do not enjoy his teeth. The final mini-boss, Mr. Chimes, is my least favorite boss in the base game, and I only fought him again here for the footage. Cuphead is a game defined by fast, snappy combat, and Mr. Chimes goes against every part of that. The final plane mini-boss, Mr. Chimes moves around the screen like a DVD logo, which means there are a lot of times that he's to the left of your plane and thus can't be damaged. The player just has to dodge and wait until he's moved somewhere that the player could hit again. On top of that, Mr. Chimes is invincible on top of Memory Game. The player has to match 2 cards, then Mr. Chimes becomes damageable and starts clapping his cymbals to release some damaging magic notes until he hits a health gate. Then, you'll need to play Memory again, and if you mess up, he starts to speed up until you figure it out. This gameplay loop makes this fight take absurdly long. This particular run you're watching, which granted is an absolute mess, took almost 2 minutes to get through the mini-boss. The actual fight against King Dice proper on this same attempt took only 30 seconds. Mr. Chimes brings the entire boss fight to a screeching halt, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone who intentionally chooses to fight Mr. Chimes when they reach King Dice. After getting to the end of the board, the player finally faces King Dice, who wears his jazz influence on his sleeve. He's heavily based on Cab Calloway, an American jazz singer who was rotoscoped dancing and singing into a couple of animation classics. The song Heidi Ho Man is why King Dice says Heidi Ho in his death screen. His Smash Bros. Spirit picture is just a Cab Calloway picture, and he even recreates some of the famous dances one-to-one in the animated show. Not only does King Dice have a jazz number he sings at the end of each aisle, performed by the extraordinary Alana Bridgewater. She kills the absolute hell out of that song, by the way. But his attacks have his gloved hands on the ground and will dance, exactly mimicking classic Cab Calloway dances. In terms of the actual attack, it's a parade of cards coming out of those dancing hands, now reduced to only spades and hearts, with the hearts being parryable, meaning the player's job is to stay in the air, going parryable card to parryable card, before getting a moment to rest and doing the whole thing again. On release, all 4 suits appeared, but I'm assuming they removed diamonds so suits would either be black or parryable, but then they wanted there to be just one of each suit. The phase is difficult to execute at first, but it's incredibly satisfying. There's no tricks or surprises here, it's just a really satisfying end of the gauntlet. King Dice is an incredibly successful villain. The combination of his earlier songs, his strong design, and the entire buildup of the gauntlet makes him an incredible foe to take down. I'm not going to hold it against his grade, but this fight does end up feeling a lot less satisfying with Miss Chalice. It creates some parryable sparks above the cards, but it doesn't have the same rhythm as using Cuphead and Mugman's parry. Overall, this is an amazing endgame boss rush, and I can't give it anything other than an S grade. If I had to rank the mini-bosses, it would go Mr. Chimes, Tipsy Troop, Mangosteen, Chips Bedigan, Hopus Pocus, Fear Lap, Pirouette, Pippin Dot, and Mr. Wheezy. In terms of death quotes, though, there's a bundle here to pull from, but I think I have to give the award to who's also my least favorite boss, Mr. Chimes. Monkey See? Monkey Doom. And finishing up the base game and today's video, we have the final battle with the Devil in one hell of a time. Like King Dice, the Devil is pretty well set up as the game's final threat. The thin and gaunt design, inspired by the Hell's Bells short from Disney's Silly Symphonies, manages to land right in that golden zone between threatening and goofy. And I love the concept of the Devil running a casino. Right off the bat, the 3D effect as he leans forward and the scream from Cuphead or Mugman feels great, and cements that this is the final challenge you need to overcome, especially since both boss themes, Admission to Perdition and One Hell of a Time, start to reprise and repeat musical themes from the rest of the game. The first phase features the devil sitting on his throne, regularly sending out fragile devils that'll run across the arena, warning you which side they're about to pop out of in the background. Even if the player is pretty close to the edge, directing their attack to where the devil spawns can clear the threat pretty quickly. The devil himself is fairly high up and only takes damage on his pretty small head, and he cycles between two types of attacks. First are summoned projectiles, one of which is always parryable. 4 bubbles that start bouncing around the arena is often the easiest to dodge. Since they take a moment to start moving, you can occasionally even get rid of the parryable bubble right off the top if it spawned at the bottom. The next creates 6 fireballs that shoot towards the player one after the other, staying in a straight line from their original shot. This does force the player towards the edge of the arena really well, which makes it both hard to keep pressure on the devil, while also not being overwhelming if you're playing defensively. The last summon is what I find to be the toughest attack to handle in this first phase. 5 flames spawn, with the middle being parryable. The 4 outside form a square that rotates on itself while moving back and forth. Keeping pressure on the devil here is even harder than it was on the 6 flames, and the attack goes on long enough that it remains a consistent challenge to dodge for the entire duration. If you don't parry that middle flame pretty early on, it becomes an absolute nightmare. On top of those summons, the devil also has 3 thematic transformations. He transforms into a goat, clapping his hooves together and forcing the player to stall in the air through either a well-timed dash or stalling with an EX move, or turns into a snake that weaves across the stage, forcing the player into one of the walls. The goat and snake both have some obvious biblical ties, though the last transformation turns his head into a spider that just slams near the player. The spider head keeping its hurt box does keep the attack engaging, even if it loses the theme, and the visual of the spider does seem inspired by the spider in Hell's Bells. Overall, the first phase is very chaotic, and I've always personally found it to be the hardest part of the boss fight. Once you're about halfway through his health bar, the devil jumps out of his own skin and into a pit, forcing the player to follow as flames close off the arena above. I particularly enjoy the fact that his trident seems to also lose its bones and slough onto the ground with his skin. The player lands on a series of 5 floating platforms, moving up and down while the devil grows massively in size, turning into the entire background his eyes' giant hurt boxes. Intermittently, flaming poker chips fall, making one of the platforms dangerous and forcing the player to move. The chips start on either the far left or far right, and then move across the screen, looping around at the end. The rest of the second phase is pretty similarly mellow compared to other late game bosses. The attacks all have long pauses between them, and they're all pretty simple. The 2 eyes merge together, creating a small axe that spins out in progressively larger circles, or he turns his head to the side, creating a parryable bomb that comes out of his ear and explodes a few moments later, covering almost half the screen. At the end of the day though, there's usually only one thing the player needs to worry about at a time in this phase, letting them get used to the platforms and how best to position themselves, and giving them a short break from the first phase's chaos. The third phase is the biggest challenge within this environment. The outside platforms fall away, making the falling chips more of a recurring threat. The platforms also start to move up and down faster and with more extreme, getting more and more vertically out of sync with each other. Because of this, dodging the chips can become even more of a risk on top of the frequency, because now you actually have to jump instead of just dashing. The rest of the attacks here are all minion-based. Purple minions dropped on either side that shoot skulls, making dodging the chips even more complicated, or these little flies pressed out of his forehead that come spinning down towards the player. Taking the time to kill the minions makes the phase much safer, because this phase can get really busy. But after you've prioritized the minions, he's not able to provide a threat until he resummons them. The final phase drops away another set of platforms, leaving the player on just a single one as the devil begins to cry and scream. Tears fall on each side as poker chips keep falling on this one place, forcing the player to jump off their safe platform, maneuver around the tears and the chips. On regular, that's not too demanding, but the tears are falling ridiculously fast on expert, to the point using invincibility's super art is often the better way to get through the phase. Though it does serve as a fun victory lap, I've never found it a particularly satisfying phase, especially since the death screen doesn't change between any of these 3 final phases. Though it's an amazing fight, it does fall short of the best in my opinion. It feels like a final boss and the scale is larger, but the simplicity of the second half of the fight does hold it back somewhat. The breakdown is great, but the phase that joins it has never clicked for me, though it does work a lot better when playing as Miss Chalice with her double jump. Overall, I think I'd give it an A grade. It's a great boss, just not one of my personal favorites. The death quotes are also some of the most disappointing in the game, but the art of the second one really carries it. Anyone who opposes me will be destroyed. It's pretty straightforward, but it does decently well. Unless, of course, he was just having a breakdown, in which case it seems pretty out of place to go from him crying and screaming to anyone who opposes me will be destroyed. And with that, that is all 19 of the bosses in the base game of Cuphead analyzed. That said, we're not done. We still need to take a taste of the delicious last course, which boasts another 6 bosses and 6 mini-bosses, all of whom we'll be breaking down next time in a slightly shorter video. Originally, this was all just going to be one video, but even just the recording of session of this has taken almost 3.5 hours, and the script is 55 pages. So I figured I should get this out. Because it's been over a month. But thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the delicious last course. Using Betty Boop's color scheme combined with Olive Oil's body shape, topped with an absurdly long noise. With the final boss of Aisle 1 being Cagney Carnation in Floral Flurry. Floral Fury. Wow. After falling off his bumper car and starting his roller coaster, the Beppi. Yawn time! The cupcake, Mufsky Chernikov, flies... Chernikov. How Russian is this muffin? The cupcake, Mufsky Chernikov, flies diagonally. Chernikov flies diagonally. Oh my god. Dr. Kahl's Dr. Kahl's rhubarb pie. Anyone who opposes... I don't even know what to say about the Silk Song. I just needed to put it in the video. Maybe I might even cut this part. I don't know.